this fact is very important for our purposes here, which is that Heather is also a poet. And as a poet, she's the author of Forms and Hollows, 2 chapbooks, and a play produced by a community theater. The journals where her poetry has appeared include Prairie Schooner, Southern Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, and Yale Review. A few of her poems have been set to music and performed, and she is the director of Fordham's Poets Out Loud poetry reading series. And I believe we're going to have some copies, I'm correct, of your poetry. Yes, so be sure to look for that at our book sale tables. Ryan Netzley is Associate Professor of English and Director of Graduate Studies at Southern Illinois University-Carbondale. His scholarly work focuses on the immediate presence and experience of signs and events in Renaissance lyric, devotional verse, and apocalyptic and martyrological treatises. He's the author of the forthcoming Lyric Apocalypse, Milton Marvell and the Nature of Events, which comes out in like 3 weeks, right? Yeah. From Fordham University Press. And of Reading Desire and the Eucharist in Early Modern Religious Poetry, which I think will also be at the book table. And this latter book is an examination of sacramental presence's impact on desire and reading in English devotional lyrics from Donne to Milton. He's also the editor with Thomas P. Anderson of Acts of Reading, Interpretation, Reading Practices, and the Idea of the Book in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, a collection of essays that examines the hypertextual reading practices applied to Fox's tome, today and in early modernity. He's currently at work on a study of debt, equality, and sameness in 17th century lyrics. So we'll begin with Heather first, and then Ryan afterwards, and we'll save questions until the end, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for those. So Heather.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm delighted and honored to be here, less delighted that I'm getting over a bug and I may sound like your 13-year-old sons. I'm also very pleased that since I am the first speaker, it's appropriate for me, on behalf of everybody in the audience, to express some thanks. Above all, to Kimberly Johnson for the vision behind, is that now good? Good. For the vision behind the conference, all her efficiency in organizing it, and how graciously she's made all her guests feel at home. Please hold your applause, though, till the end, till everybody. John Rosenberg, Dean of Humanities, also contributed in many ways. Phil Snyder, English Department Chair. Matt Wickman, Director of the Humanities Center. Charlotte Stanford, Coordinator of the Medieval and Renaissance Studies Group. Plus, more personally, I'd like to express thanks to 3 graduate students who've been very helpful to me, and I'm sure that many of their colleagues are being helpful to other guests, too. Dan Gillian, Brittany Rabarchek, and Adrian Thane. How about uproarious applause for everybody? Could I close the screen here without screwing anything up? No, it would turn it off, wouldn't it? Maybe I'll just move this back. Okay. Some years ago, I was finishing one of the books that Jason was referring to, Challenges of Orpheus, and in the hallway of my apartment building, I ran into my next-door neighbor, who's an investment banker at Chase. When he asked how I was doing, I said to him, well, I was working very hard because I was trying to finish a book before my sabbatical ended. Oh, John said, what are you reading? It took me a minute, too. I open on that story about the separate worlds of different professions because I want to explore with you the potential collisions, collusions, and cooperation among several different worlds in our profession, between specialists in the early modern period and their counterparts in Victorian studies, for example, or between those reading devotional and secular lyrics. More specifically, I'll suggest that the marginalization, if not the erasure, of the devotional lyric in many particular theoretical models, especially though not exclusively those developed by students of later literatures, has distorted our readings of lyric poetry. Culling just a few instances, which I stress include several critics who I respect very much on other grounds, I'd cite the work of W.R. Johnson on classical poetry, John Stuart Mill on overhearing, Helen Wendler's overarching conceptions of lyric, some of Jonathan Culler's work, particularly his theory of apostrophe, the concepts of lyricization developed by Virginia Jackson and Yopi Prinz, and the model of lyric cited dismissively by language poets. This marginalization is the fraternal twin of the frequent predilection for its mirror image, embedding the type of lyric in which the critic holds stock as normative. Crucial exceptions are not hard to come by among the many important theorists of lyric who do engage extensively with devotional poetry are Susan Stewart and, of course, Kimberly Johnson herself. But the influence of the alternative approaches remains strong, not least because it's frequently unacknowledged. In contrast, giving devotional lyric more prominence in our overarching theories of its mode would encourage revisionist interpretations of fundamental questions ranging from its putative brevity to its relationship to narrative, to cite just a few. Obviously, this approach to the dangers in neglecting devotional lyric when generalizing about the mode paradoxically packs enough tangled, dangling wires and ticking bombs to alert any bomb squad worth its well-trained dogs. The first is turning other critics and modes of criticism into the straw men, who are often the earliest and most welcome registrants at conferences. Helen Wendler, for example, does adjust some of her contentions when writing about Herbert. Second, let me emphasize from the get-go that I'm not arguing that we should replace the neglect of devotional lyric in certain crucial transhistorical theories with its instantiation as the new normal. Rather, I suggest it helps us bring to the surface cognate characteristics segmented and often fragmented within or especially lyrics far removed from devotional poems. In sketching how that devotional poetry can lead us variously to inflect and reject fundamental assumptions about its mode, then, I'll winnow two characteristics often enshrined as the signatures of lyric: the concept of the lyric I as a universalized voice with whom the reader can identify, and lyric as the world of the immediate, the here and now. That long-standing representation of lyric subjectivity remains widespread despite significant challenges to it in, for example, Bonnie Costello's recent work. But this symposium is a particularly apt place to reconsider the conventional wisdom on the lyric subject, not least because some of its participants have already published important work on related issues, though from perspectives different from mine. For example, Mutlu Blazing has written powerfully and provocatively on the communal activity of lyric and the conflict between the lyric I as an agent of language and the countervailing patterns in the poems. Kimberly Johnson's skilled adaptation of the concept of anti-absorbative poetics, that is, the insistent awareness of the poem, as object, calls into question a model of the lyric I that, as it were, removes cultural specificities to envision a single voice. More specifically, though, I want to suggest that the psalm, as both represented and performed in early modern England, involved a range of overlapping but distinct and separable voices that repeat each other's words consecutively, but without complete identification. Thus, many assumptions about the lyric I and the possibility of identifying with it are unsettled. For psalms were widely represented as dictated by God to David. Some illustrations actually show the Holy Ghost poised conveniently by David's ear, and thence to the current performers. In an intriguing line, though time constraints preclude an appropriately detailed comment on it, Donne's poem on the Sidney translations refers to a cloven tongue. The controversies surrounding the Reformation practices of congregational singing surely directed attention to it. And let me gesture briefly as well towards two other ways devotional lyrics can challenge common assumptions about the lyric I. Those whose speaker identifies him or herself as a minister may complicate such assumptions, a point to which we may want to return during our discussion, perhaps in relation to Mutlu's subtle arguments. Lyric theories often fall apart. Yes, if there's any way, thank you, great. Okay. Mutlu's subtle arguments about the textual signatures of lyric. Context and mode of production and transmission may also compromise that figure and the possibility of identifying with it. For example, Ulrich Langer, a distinguished critic of 16th century French poetry, develops earlier critics' distinctions between a poem by Novalis in a prayer book and in a collection of his poetry, maintaining that only in the second instance does something that should be categorized as lyric subjectivity emerge. But as I've emphasized, incorporating devotional lyrics in revisionist theories of their mode crystallizes practices and possibilities in secular lyrics as well. Psalm singing, I suggest, provided an important model for song and secular poems, including ones that were not necessarily performed, but that I would describe as being written under the sign of lyric, under the sign of song. In secular songs, whether or not they're performed, we're often aware of one voice singing the words of another in a process that doesn't involve, indeed that may resist, a stable subjectivity for either voice. Witness how Desdemona introduces her willow song. My mother had a maid called Barbary. She had a song of willow, an old thing. Moreover, Sarah Ivan has persuasively shown that instrumentation may function not as a simple accompaniment, but rather as divergent voices in its own right. Yet another complication in the idea of the lyric eye, and in demonstrating powerfully how secular song can build community, Sarah Harris, a Fordham dissertator who did her BA right here at Brigham Young, is also revising our conceptions of lyric subjectivity. In addition to the implications for that issue, including devotional lyrics in our pantheon of models challenges the widespread assumption that the home address of the genre is the here and now. Lyric is a hot subject also. Is the here and now. In fact, not only do we need to distinguish here and now, though that's necessarily a subject for another paper, we also need to recognize that in poetry, here is often a positionality involving several different, almost here, a little further, further yet, but still here, and shifting heres. Ryan Netzley's emphasis on the difference between temporal contiguity and identity applies, I suggest, to spatiality as well. The hike, so central to the Eucharistic controversies, on which he and other participants have written trenchantly, haec est meum corpum, insistently demonstrates the complexities in the deictic or pointing words here and this. Close reading of devotional poetry can uncover analogous explorations of here and related deictics. As you can see from A on my handout, a poem that I was very pleased to talk to and with Brandy Siegfried's students last night, got some good ideas from them. In contemplating his approaching death, Donne writes, "Since I am coming to that holy room," underlined line. A close examination of its deictics establishes this poem as more edgy in several senses than most readers, including Ryan and his commentary on it, have acknowledged. For the underlined words deliver conflicting signals about their speaker's spatial, spiritual, and affective edges, so to speak, including the sense of his proximity to the holy room of heaven, and hence, too, whom he is addressing. The so-called distal deictic that, in that holy room, reminds us that he isn't there yet. But coming complicates it and may suggest that he is in that room, or that he isn't in his room, but it's his home, or he's talking about his position in relation to God or the other devoted Christians who are already in the room. In short, coming may suggest that Donne is already virtually in the holy room, or that he acknowledges it as his home, or that he is coming there from the perspective of the rest of the choir, or God himself. Yet all this is complicated not only by that holy room, but also by the deictic here, in here at the door. In some manuscripts, incidentally, it may be now at the door. In Love 3, Herbert's worthy to be here, shortly to be discussed from an angle different from mine, is another example. In short, here is nowhere as stable as generalizations about the here and now usually imply. To negotiate such questions, in lieu of assuming immediacy, we might adopt the theological concept of prevenient grace and create the term prevenient proximity for these versions of here. My coinage recalls Ryan's emphasis on anticipated grace, though he and I differ significantly, though I hope respectfully, on whether that grace is assumed to be accessible, as he maintains. In any event, in this and other respects, the workings and the breakdowns of here and now in devotional poetry can alert us to many analogs in its secular siblings. For example, the apparent immediacy and stability of a here or this in such lyrics is often compromised if it refers to the physical poem itself, anti-absorptive poetics again, given the instabilities traced by students of the material text. Witness, be also present here, in Spencer's Epithalamion. And if you glance very briefly at B, you'll see as well the way the so-called catchword, the circled word, which is the first word of the next poem, typically printed at the bottom of the previous one, blurs the line between here and there in many sonnet sequences. Okay. But what are the implications of arguments like these for our pedagogical and scholarly work? For example, if the lyric I is not characteristic, indeed constitutive of lyric, what is? And to what extent can or should our definitions and descriptions of the mode be both transhistorical and transnational, indeed global, an issue introduced by my opening anecdote about my neighbor's different world, and raised as well by my embedding my interpretations in the distinctive theological controversies and ecclesiological practices of early modern England. But my initial assertion that theories of lyric have been shaped and misshaped by regrettable professional practices does also invite me to end not only on those debatable questions, but also on a few determined assertions, even Jeremiah's, about our own work as interpreters. First, the more problematical definitions of lyric on which I opened exemplify a widespread practice in the academy today, the privileging of the audacious and tenacious interpretation over more modestly judicious ones. Incidentally, that delight in the audacious is often the academic and secular equivalent of what Ryan will shortly fault in literary interpretations, a commitment to teleological progress that transforms everything into a conversion narrative. And second, definitions and descriptions of lyric that ignore devotional poetry often reflect a dangerous shift in how we train our graduate students and plan our own careers. I'm grateful for comments from a couple of members of the faculty on this last night, in fact. That is, an emphasis on overly early and blinkered specialization in a particular field, or more often subdivision of it, in lieu of wider reading. But speaking of dangers, gobbling up more than one's own share of time is one of them. So let me turn to Ryan Netzley and, echoing the story on which I began, ask, what are you reading?
I too want to start with some brief thanks. Heather's already talked about the college and the department, so I'll leave that out, to both Kim Johnson and Jason Kerr, who've been interested in and supported engaged with my work for years. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks also again to Kim for putting this whole thing together. It's so far worked seamlessly. Okay. I'm here today to talk about the present and future of critical studies of early modern devotional lyrics. So I guess I'll begin by talking about the past. A decade ago now, Ken Jackson and Arthur Murati both described and advocated a turn to religion in early modern English studies. Theirs remains a curious essay because it both diagnosed a problem within early modern studies, which was new historicism's under-theorized notion of alterity, and announced its already present solution, the intractability of religion as an object of study. Let me rephrase that. Early modern religion, via its very irreducibility to modern understandings of otherness, would reveal to us not only new worlds to be conquered by our critical acumen, but also the limits and shadow investments of our conceptual understandings. And this is Jackson and Marotti. The turn to religion in critical theory and in the hyper-historicizing of early modern literary studies suggests that we may still be more religious than we wish to be, even in our most secular of critical methodologies. I want to start with this essay today because I think it's a very sophisticated attempt to take religion seriously as an object of study. That is, it's not just using religion as a bludgeon with which to beat neoliberalism or proceduralist structuralism of post-Enlightenment states. That's very much what Stanley Fish means when he enjoins us to take religion seriously. Parliamentary democracy is bad. But taking religion seriously, even in the sophisticated manner that Jackson and Marotti adopt, has its own pitfalls, I want to argue today, especially insofar as it entails a set of critical and scholarly gestures borrowed in part from a logic of epiphany and conversion, in part from a much more pragmatic sequence of problems and solutions. Today, I want to suggest that devotional lyrics bear a more complicated relationship to scholarship than that of engines for exposing the secretly pious leanings of our own disciplinary procedures. As Paul Stevens has recently noted, there's something fundamentally instrumental about all such critical turns to religion, however much their prophets insist that they are the ones to take religion and devotion seriously. And there's that phrase again, which will come up over and over and over again, treating something seriously. In most critical discourse, such calls for serious attention end up imagining religion as a pragmatic solution to a problem, and this is Stevens. One is immediately struck by the way that all the scholars we have been discussing acknowledge no authority but their own. That is, the irony that they write so confidently from within the normative boundaries of the culture they are so anxious to replace. Their approach to religion, or the way they present that approach, is overwhelmingly pragmatic or instrumental. We have a problem, they seem to say. How best can a turn to religion solve it? As Stevens indicates here, religion fits seamlessly into the critical architecture of our own essay production. Carve out a research gap or problem and use the square peg of religion to fill it. Such an approach certainly seems to do a disservice to devotion, but I also think it ends up doing a disservice to essays, that they can be nothing more experimental and adventurous than the creation of problems inevitably solved. It's for this reason, I think the turn to religion is nonetheless potentially valuable and not simply parasitic or predatory. It might prompt us, despite ourselves, to rethink what we mean when we propose that we're writing criticism of a humanist or literary bent. But of course, there's a trap there too, thinking that we can replace an instrumentalist calculus of late capitalism with a more attractive notion of vocation. That's in fact the tack of a recent Inside Higher Ed piece by Johan Neem, which argues that humanities education should model itself on ministerial education. But yet here too, even in calling for some other way of valuing humanities' work, the form of valuing assumes the model that Stevens describes. We've got a problem, and religion, or in this case, vocational or religious education, can solve it. Today, then, I want to talk briefly about the nature of critical turnings and its relationship to the process of conversion within lyric, not just the I was once this and now I'm not of conversion's completion, but the act and event itself as a formal depiction inside of verse. As Heather notes, the concept of turning, conceived as design or deceit or desire, is central to early modern notions of verse, right? And that versus, whether inversion or conversion, is a flipping or change that is, I'm arguing, nonetheless not the result of an external crisis. And in this respect, maybe at the break, we might want to talk about whether we really mean it when we call them line breaks. My overarching question then is this: by focusing on a turn to religion, are we transforming all devotional lyrics into conversion narratives, yearning for the pulse-pounding drama of turmoil and epiphany? In a related vein, he pauses as he fumbles. Yeah, that was a nice long pause. What constitutes a formal turn in a lyric poem that's not simply narrating a spiritual autobiography? In the end, I think this is also a question of what formal features allow us to recognize conversion, kairos, or even learning as they happen. Let me start then with the most contentious claim in this paper. Lyric form enables us to imagine devotion post-conversion, the long stretch of time not marked by drama, or epiphany for that matter. A pivotal moment of life-changing recognition might intensify or spark love, but it is not love. Devotion is the temporal expansion of this intensity, the technique, discipline, and form of its persistence, and more importantly, its development and growth as something more than mere kairotic buttonholing. That is, there's more to devotion than recreating and re-experiencing conversion. And a devotional culture, then, relies on an active development, a cultus or cultivation that results in but also attends to a form. Yet that process, making a form while also caring for and attending to it lovingly, precludes an instrumentalist understanding of the world, the production of forms and objects or machines as solutions to ready-made problems, inconveniences, or even catastrophes. After all, in any cultus, you're still caring for and maintaining the shrine, the practice, the devotion, even if everything is going swimmingly. Right? Offerings made, floors swept, endowment prosperous. That, in fact, is what a culture is: growth, development, expansion, and self-reproduction without the triumphalist projection of an end or a goal, or the equally triumphalist satisfaction of drama or romance. Cultures are not on a quest, and ones that think that they are very, very dangerous. To put it in more classical terms, it's a form without a final cause, telos, not because we cannot know such a thing, and it's really up to God, but rather because our worshipful, devotional, and even ethical impulses are not solutions or necessitated reactions. Sin is not a problem with a solution, in short. What culture is definitely not, then, is a response to problems, because solutions are, frankly, suicidal and homicidal. They eliminate what they seek to remedy, but also annihilate themselves in the process. We have, no doubt, concocted all sorts of explanations for the needs that culture fills, but in doing so, we have robbed it of what makes it both joyful and interesting. All right, so perhaps instead of me just nattering on in general, how about if we actually talk about a poem? And unsurprisingly, it's going to be Herbert's Love 3. So I'll just read this at you. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful. Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame, my dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. I've written elsewhere about this poem as an exposure of the sinful attractiveness of lack and absence and all the self-pitying machinations that masquerade as contrition. But you didn't bring me here for a greatest hits compilation. Today, I'd like to linger over this poem for a few moments, mainly because of its temporality and the pedagogy that attends it. And I think my own reading here chimes with what Heather's just had to say about dialectics and here in the first line. To put a very fine point on it, does the final line, so I did sit and eat, mean that the speaker has learned a lesson, overcome the problem of his reticence via the solution of familiarity? Or is that sort of developmental narrative precisely what this poem thinks is of dubious validity? After all, this is a speaker who is trying to reanimate the abjection and then epiphany of conversion. The poem, I'd argue, presents this reanimation as an attempt not to learn from and not even to listen to love's responses. Love's response to the speaker's own self-abnegation, he insists, after all, that he is not a worthy guest, is instructive precisely because it marks a turn from narrative recounting to futural promise. When the speaker laments that he lacks a guest worthy to be here, Love's response creates and affirms the speaker's own worth. You shall be he. But just as importantly, the poem here colludes with the speaker in treating this interaction as a past event. After all, the speaker reports what Love said in the past. He seems to reject the futural implications of this claim with false humility, but his subsequent reports of what Love says are all in the present tense. In other words, even though the speaker continues with his ostensible refusal of Love's promise, the temporal dimension of his reporting has changed. He still imagines his own actions in the past, but Love queries and commands him in the present, in that final stanza. Or to put it another way, he doesn't learn, but the form of his reporting learns. The pivotal turn in this development is you shall be he, right, which reads as both a future promise, as in you shall be he in the future if you follow these 8 simple steps, the BuzzFeed version of devotion, and as a present performative that Love affects in the moment of its enunciation, as in you shall be he, and by uttering that phrase, I have made it so immediately. What is important about this ambiguity isn't its irreducibility so much as it is the poem's formal allegiance with the speaker's own error. Love has just solved the problem, but the poem still keeps going, keeps surging forward after the authoritative pronouncement has been made. Thus, this poem is an exposé of the mania that humans, or at least poetic speakers, have for a problem-solution structure, one that would again take seriously the speaker's self-generated and ultimately sophistical lack, but it is also a critique of the revelatory power of interlocution, questioning, deliberation, and even exposition. Love is certainly a patient interlocutor, right, who takes seriously the concerns and queries of the speaker. However, it is also precisely the clarity and responsiveness of this form of interaction that the poem reveals is detrimental to any attempt at conversion, let alone moving beyond conversion to a life of devotion. After all, the final line, so I did sit and eat, suddenly and inexplicably agrees with the performative presence and effectiveness of you shall be he. The poem, though, if it explains this leap, does so only through the aforementioned tense shift in the reporting, and perhaps the fact that it occurs in the concluding couplet of an ABABCC stanza form. So let's take a brief tour through the poem's formal feature, especially its metrics. Regardless of who speaks the second trimeter lines in these stanzas, the last 2 stanzas present in a question and answer format. Wandering and wordy pentameter question, followed by a clipped trimeter solution. The enjambments early in the poem, during the lyric's initial scene setting, thwart any easy metrical mapping in that respect. But the final 4 lines, however, hew closely to this pattern, as does the already mentioned sequence, a guest you shall be he. And here are the last 4 lines again. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame. My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says Love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. The metrical pattern implies that so in the final line carries the weight of therefore, but the word itself just as likely connotes then or correspondingly or in that manner, as in I did sit and eat just in the way that Love asked. To put another fine point on it then, how we read so will very much determine whether this is a poem rife with solutions to problems or one in which problems are sinful inventions used to justify our own inertia. There's potentially something presumptuous, of course, about leaping to eating when love only invites tasting, but that's only part of the problem. What I'm interested in today is the translation of temporal proximity, words like then and so, into invitations for causal exposition. For example, my dear, then I will serve, sounds like retort on the part of the speaker, then treated as a result. But that reading assumes that love's bearing of the responsibility for sin is a problem to be solved and not the solution itself. The speaker isn't just being prideful in this moment, but is insisting that there's still a problem when there's not. And that's not even to get into the more basic problem. Does the speaker or love intone, "My dear, then I will serve"? What I'm really hastily trying to sketch here on top of this canonical poem is the extent to which our own intellectual forms shape the way we approach a devotional poem, a lyric, etc. I'm not opposed to solving problems. Well, maybe I am. And I'm certainly not advocating that to students in this audience that you rebel against traditional essay prompts or the professors who use them. But I am suggesting that the way we think of literary study and the production of literary criticism has been utilitarian and instrumentalist for quite some time, notwithstanding condemnations of the humanities' uselessness. The turn to religion, then, is interesting, to circle back, precisely insofar as it challenges the resolving reversals that dominate our understanding of productive intellectual labor, because that is what we want from even our intellectual work, that it be productive, innovative, and expansive. And Heather's already spoken about this. That's not just because we're all doing capitalism or 19th century imperialism in our minds. It's because a problem-solution architecture, just like conversion, allows us maybe to know when we're done. So maybe perhaps one last unsurprising poem as we close today. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town, to another do labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. You know the rest of that poem, so I'm not going to read that. I really only want to focus on those last two lines anyway. I, like an usurped town, to another do labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. I'd like to offer a somewhat idiosyncratic reading of this line, maybe in closing. Namely, the reason that the speaker cannot admit God in this poem that yearns for a violent conversion is that the same speaker imagines the process of reception and conversion as a labor with or without an end. So it's not just that there's a purposeless circularity in this poem or the patent hypocrisy of a bossy masochist. Rather, it's the projection of a problem that readers, especially professional and academic readers, are trapped into solving. The fact that the sonnet keeps on going, perhaps presenting the sonnet form as itself a mechanism of solution, only limes that particular twig. My concern today about the critical study of devotional lyrics is not just that we'll respond to given problems, thereby hobbling the creativity of our own solutions. It's also that we'll only be able to imagine creativity as a response to problems, as a compensatory substitute for our own fallenness. In that world, there is no gift, no compassion, no joy that is not initially motivated by a cruelly cynical lack. There is also no devotion uncorrupted by mercenary impulses or spectacular duplicity. A turn to devotion, if not religion, matters for literary study because it allows us to rethink how creativity might occur inside the humanities as a series of scholarly disciplines, certainly, but also inside the daily activity of humanistic learning. The form of change, the formal turns I've been trying to describe today, matter because they're not really problems to be solved, cruxes to be interpreted back into a more regular continuum. That means that we're not solving problems, and that's not a bad thing. After all, problems always end in the same way. They get liquidated. From devotional lyrics, then, humanities learning might, just might, be able to glean a vision of its own activity that didn't fetishize crisis and its elimination as the primary means of engagement with the world. At the very least, we would then be able to speak a bit more cogently about what we're doing in literature classrooms, not critical thinking with its perpetual crises and hurried reactions, but the creative cultivation of something that might be worthy of devotion and love. No solution, however grand, no answer, however sublime, is worthy of that. Thank you.
All right, we should have a couple minutes here for questions. Is there a microphone that people need to speak into so that they can be heard?
No, you just have to yell.
Okay.
And we can repeat the questions, too.
That's true.
Yes, please.
I've got a question for you. I read once a remark from Frank Kermode. He was was talking about criticism more broadly, not devotional lyrics specifically, but I think your talk is extends beyond early modern devotional lyrics. He said that criticism can be a cause for change, but never one for progress. I agree with him, and from your talk, it sounds like you do too. But how does liberal humanists sort of live the double life of recognizing that their intellectual activity is not necessarily progressive, but their politics tend to be? And how do you live with that paradox in the classroom, in your publications, in your research, and those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, at some level, can everybody? Okay, it's worse. My voice is usually loud enough. In some ways, I would almost argue that there is no such thing as a progressive politics, right? In other words, and so there's a way in which what this is suggesting is that I'm not trying to take a hammer, and I'm not secretly siding with fish on the kind of save the world on your own time sort of gambit. But I do think that probably if we're talking about progress or change in the world, and maybe I would disagree with Kermode in that respect, that if we're looking to the political, right, as the realm of change, then, and I'm not suggesting we don't do that, and that isn't the assumption of the academy, but I'm almost suggesting that sometimes it seems to me that it's an almost self-loathing assumption, that out there in this other world of state legislatures or the political world or PTAs is where change occurs, and that we must justify in some ways in what we do in reaction to that reality. I'm just wondering whether we should, in fact, abandon that notion and think that progress doesn't reside in the political realm, because it will always churn the same fight, a fight over power. And maybe that's not what education is.
Can I have a question that sort of seeks to defuse the political heat of Bert's question, but I think it's related. So do you think that there's, that it seems to me that each of you are talking about or advocating an approach to poetry that allows instability and uncertainty to have its head in the poem. So do you think that there's a point to those of us who are reading poems, some sort of takeaway or methodology that we could bring to poems? Like what do these poems teach us about readings, I guess? Something that I'd love to hear you both talk about. You'll start.
Okay. Is that working now? Yes. Let me respond to both parts of it. Certainly we emphasize instability, but I'm concerned that the pendulum has swung too far in our post-structuralist critical discourse, and we need to say that sometimes poems do at least partly resolve things. Somebody wrote poetry is one of the few worlds where we can get at least partial solutions, and I do believe that, so I would at least complicate some of the assumptions behind the questions. Okay. As far as what I think you're asking about how poetry works to do this, I would be interested in the relationship between form, for example, and other things going on, how a couplet doesn't necessarily summarize, but it can represent a desire to summarize, an attempt to summarize.
I thanks so much. This is just an amazing way to start off this whole event, and such a great way of thinking about what the two of you are thinking together. And as Heather highlighted, the potential tensions between your talks, although in so many ways they were speaking with some of the same Jeremiads. So I guess one thing I was thinking, maybe to cue off of Ryan, your response to the question, that I think about politics, we could be imagining it like Hannah Arendt does, which says politics is where people interact freely. And then, of course, there's all kinds of questions about what that kind of freely means. But your sort of polarization of the two options, right, of the kind of without a telos or sort of solutions versus kind of freedom, and therefore, then in your response, therefore it's not political. Let's do something else, and let's not hold ourselves responsible to that. Seems to me to sort of miss the opportunity that I think, Heather, you're gesturing toward also with your idea of form, that there's a kind of interactivity that poems stage, that poems invite and require, and that might be an interesting model for the political, because the political, one possibility of what the political is, it's people interacting in some kind of context that's not without form, but isn't constrained by purpose or a predetermined end. And so I wonder what you think about that as a sort of way to, so in some ways it's to say, if we stop thinking about the lyric I in the singular, then we might, which is one of your suggestions, that devotional poetry helps us challenge the sort of singularity of the lyric I, and put that together with Ryan's point of, like, let's think about it not in a kind of traditional notion of solution, but that perhaps then there might be a way of thinking the two of you together. So I guess I just ask both of you to comment on where your points, your ways of reading might converge as well as the ways in which they still seem to you significantly different.
Well, the first thing I guess I have to say about that is that I think, and tell me if this is wrong, I think Heather's more interested in space and I'm more interested in time. Right? At least now. At least now. And so that's not answering your question really, but I do think that when so in the question of coming or arrival, right, it's centrality in what Heather was talking about today. I'm always interested in whether, how do you know what an arrival or a coming looks like? In other words, is there deferral, or is the kind of sheer process, right? And so I think in that sense, that's maybe the kind of internal version of it. But out of that probably, and you'll have to correct me on this, I think that Heather's work is much more interested, and rightly so, in poetry as a principle or an engine of relation. I, on the other hand, am interested in, and maybe in some ways arguing against, in escapist or even anarchist or even radically non-relational excision from the world. Now, that doesn't make for, and that is why the answer to the politics question seems somewhat, if not dismissive, at least like I'm heading off to a cabin in the woods. But I'm being dismissive of my own political version there, but it is, I think that's a serious question about whether what literature does is relate entities. In other words, that it's a kind of mechanism of interconnection, and that relation is always king, or whether it is interesting precisely because it refuses that imperative, right? Which is also in some ways the imperative of everything from culture to exchange to communication, well, to a certain extent even to love, right? So that's the way in which it's this odd tension inside of even what I'm saying.
So I think we're going to give Heather the last word here, and then we'll conclude.
I'll say very briefly that Ryan and I don't see eye to eye on the political issues here, but that's another conversation, probably over a meal. I think his point about relation is quite true, and is a kind of answer to Constance's point. One way poetry allows us to negotiate a lot of things is by playing voices against each other, and by playing, and Lulu has written so well on this, characteristics that don't necessarily fit in with other characteristics, and create exactly the sort of dialogue that is the poetic version of the kind of dialogue this conference and your questions are establishing so well.
Join me in thanking our panelists. This was great.